This is the revised edition from 1951. We've got different contents. So I think we're going to start with Chapter 1, The First Signs of Plague, which is on page 1. So we've also got some illustrations as well. There's a preface and a preface to the new edition as well. Okay, so here we go. This is Chapter 1. The Great Plague in London in 1665. First signs of plague. Late into dark December nights of the year 1664, London citizens sat up to watch a new blazing star, with mighty talk thereupon. King Charles II and his Queen gazed out of the windows of Whitehall. About east it rose, reaching no great altitude, and sank below the southwest horizon between 2 and 3 o'clock. In a week or two it was gone. Then letters came from Vienna notifying the like sight of a brilliant comet, and in the air the appearance of a coffin, which causes great anxiety of thought amongst the people. Erfurt saw with it other terrible apparitions, and listeners detected noises in the air as of fires and sounds of cannon and musket shot. The report ran that one night in the February following, hundreds of persons had seen flames of fire for an hour together, which seemed to be thrown from Whitehall to St. James's and then back again to Whitehall, whereafter they disappeared. In March there came into the heavens a yet brighter comet, visible 2 hours after midnight, and so continuing till daylight. With such ominous portents, the Great Plague in London was ushered in. Report of plague had been on the continent. The learned in these matters held the first comet to be propitious to England, but ominous to France and Holland. The second puzzled the wisest of them. Astrologers found also in a conjunction of Mars and Saturn, which had occurred in November, a presage of war, pestilence, and famine. The temptation is strong to dismiss with a gesture of contempt such idle fears and speculations, but we shall little understand London's populace in 1665 by so doing. It obscures the truth to envisage the middle 17th century through a medium of popular knowledge in the 20th. The educated classes generally may have known better, though even of these a goodly part believed in portents, and they had fled before the advancing plague. The court, the lawyers, and an unhappily large proportion of physicians and divines. But 11 of the bulk who remained could read and write. The printed sheet most widely circulating was William Lilly's Almanac, published each year from 1644 till his death. This and others like passed in thousands from hand to hand, and were expounded, their mystifying diagrams and spells, and forecasts of events satisfying minds to which greater literature was unknown. The numerals of the year 1666, with their thrice repetition, had inspired a whole book by one Francis Potter, which claimed to prove that the 3 sixes together made a number of exquisite and perfect character, truly exactly and essentially describing farmers in the Great Fire that year had no reason to bless the treble number. A prophet of the Great Plague named Edlin made a fortunate shot, actually predicting the epidemic in its correct time. But a month or two before the Great Plague appeared, 3 hapless women had been hanged as witches. Their trial at Suffolk Assizes in March 1665 had all the law's dread formality, and presiding was Sir Matthew Hale, whose high character made him deservedly one of the most renowned of Commonwealth and Restoration judges. Hale made no doubt at all of the existence of witches, as proved, he said simply, by the Scriptures, general consent, and Acts of Parliament. And if learned men rejected portents in the skies as influencing human affairs, it was with half reservations. Dr. George Thomson was skilled in the medical practice of his day, and seeking to enlarge knowledge, he had the great courage to dissect the corpse of a plague victim. Although impatient with many idle superstitions held by the common people, he himself wrote that comets or blazing stars do portend some evil to come upon mortals is confirmed by long observation and sad experience, as likewise phenomena of new stars, battles fought, and coffins carried through the air, howlings, screechings, and groans heard about churchyards, also raining of blood, unwanted matter, etc., all of which have something extra naturam, are portentous and prodigious. They who so testified their faith were able to fleck their pages with passages in Latin and Greek, signs of pedantic learning. Who then shall wonder that the ignorant masses, in the terror and distress of a huge public calamity, accepted comets as manifestations of heaven's wrath, believed that gold, if only obtained pure, would eject all diseases from the human frame, that the toad amulet was a charm against plague, and unicorn's horn a certain cure? Any who wished to see coffins carried in the air, to hear howlings and groans in churchyards, be sure would see and hear them. To such these events and portents were real, terrifying. The state of medical knowledge gave small confidence in its efficacy to combat the death that stalked abroad. Their minds, receptive to wonders, if to little else, the untutored people turned from medicine to the astrologers, the nostrum dealers, and the quacks who promised immunity, and in ever-increasing numbers fattened upon their fears. There had been rumours of plague in Holland towards the close of 1663, and definite evidence of its spread there next summer. Little, however, was known concerning it. London had lost the partisan Mercuries and Diurnals, which had been so numerous under the Commonwealth. The printing press was enchained, but 2 newspapers circulated, Roger Lestrange's Intelligencer and News, appearing respectively on Mondays and Thursdays each week, actually a bi-weekly issue of one paper, with much repetition. Each was a little quarto sheet of 16 printed pages, till June the 1st, 1665, of 8 pages, mostly filled with advices of foreign wars and politics, the movements of the English fleet, and some sparse was no stranger to the Londoners. For 30 years then past, London had known plague, though never with large mortality since the long visitation that reached its culmination in 1647, in which year 3,597 victims perished. Plague was then in Newgate. The coroner refused to view the bodies of its victims for the reason that juries were so fearful that none would enter the prison. Indeed, so persistent had been plague since 1603, from which date weekly bills of mortality had been systematically compiled, that only in 4 widely separated years in the half-century and more had London been reported entirely free from infection. That year, 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died, her subjects were terribly visited. There were 33,347 recorded plague deaths in London. Never did the English nation, wrote Dekker, behold so much black worn as there was at her funeral. It was then but put on to try if it were fit, for the great day of mourning was set down in the book of heaven to be held afterwards. Trade wholly ceased within the city for almost half the year, and merchants and all others of any estate fled into the country. Elizabeth, retreating to Windsor from a dreadful plague in London in 1563, 1,000 dying weekly, set up a gallows in the marketplace of Windsor, on which to hang all Londoners who should venture to come there, and those bringing wares from London were alike to be hanged thereon, without judgment. It was a policy of thorough, wherever the sovereign's safety was at stake. All acquainted with the Elizabethan stage will recall how frequently playhouses were closed and the companies of actors disbanded because of the plague. Never had 2 decades passed without a startling upgrowth of the death roll in London, rising for weeks together 4, 7 and 10 times above normal figures, thus indicating the existence of violent plague. It linked back in a calamitous chain with the sweating sickness which repeatedly had afflicted the capital in King Henry VIII's reign and earlier, and by which in a single week of the year 1485 2 Lord Mayors of London in succession had perished. They were Sir Thomas Hills and William Stocker, the last elected the day after the vacancy, and himself dead 4 days later, and with them died 6 aldermen. In 1499, a severe plague in London caused King Henry VII to retire to Calais. Though early records are few, scattered references to plague in London are sufficiently numerous to suggest that for centuries back, years were rare which did not show some manifestation of endemic disease, with at intervals violent outbursts in epidemics, but these are beyond my present purpose. In a register of burials of the city church of St. Peter, Cornhill, at the close of the entries for the stricken year, 1593, the searcher comes unexpectedly upon these lines, penned in a neat Elizabethan hand. In 1593, the Lord preserved my house and me, when of the pestilence there died visitation of 1625, not from London, where scores of homes were swept clear of every living person, as this one, but taken out of the church registers of Malpas in Cheshire. Ralph Dawson figures among the first 6 of his family, buried within 11 days. He came from London in mid-July, sick of the plague, and died in his father's house, infecting the whole household. The 7th entry tells of a surprising example of a man's fortitude when awaiting death. Richard Dawson, brother to the above-named Thomas Dawson of Bradley, being sick of the plague and persevering he must die, at the time arose out of his bed and made his grave, and caused his nephew John Dawson to cast straw into the grave, which was not far from the house, and went and laid him down in the said grave, and caused clothes to be laid upon him, and so departed out of this world. This he did because he was a strong man and heavier than his said nephew, and another wench were able to bury. He died about the 23rd of August. Thus much was I credibly told. He died 1625. John Dawson, son of the above-mentioned Thomas, came into his father when his father sent for him, being sick, and having laid him down in a ditch, died in it, the 29th day of August 1625 in the night. Rose Smith, servant of the above-named Thomas Dawson, and last of the household, died of plague and was buried by William Cook, the 5th day of September 1625, near unto the said house. Till 1665 came to give new experience to England of plague's possibilities. The fateful epidemic of the year 1625 was always known as the Great Plague, and as such figures in contemporary literature and reference. That name was to be handed on to a calamity far more terrible, a calamity indeed that seemed to concentrate in a few brief months all the malignity of which plague had been capable of half a century. It made the disaster much the worse that London was ill prepared, and until realisation of the full horror confronting them was borne home, the bulk of the people had no misgivings. The Great Plague fell upon them unexpectedly. London had known a case of infection here, another there, occurring in the city and suburbs, rarely swelling into epidemic, and if noticed at all, soon forgotten. Such isolated attacks fell in widely scattered areas, irregular in time and season. The few precautions usual even in those careless days had been neglected. It had been better for London had the Londoners then living seen much more of plague, or nothing, always the crowded, insanitary, timber-built town and its festering suburbs harboured the pestilence in some obscure corner. Look for the plague's first signs, and one must look among the poor, whose squalid conditions of life were, when herded together in undrained and dirty tenements and hovels, or underground cellars, offered to it a ready lodgment. Even in the Great Plague, no magistrate succumbed, and the losses were not in large proportion among the parish officials who remained at their posts. Public credulity in these days admitted planet to figure in the bills of mortality as a cause of death, evil done by the stars in human affairs. And London had learned nothing. Sanitary science had not been born. Foul streams like the Fleet, defiled from every overhanging harvest's rain. Spring water from Tyburn and the brooks could be drawn at the conduits that stood in the more important city streets. The riverside quarter depended largely on a supply raised direct from the Thames. There were many private wells. The streets were better kept than in Queen Elizabeth's and King Charles I's times, though alleys in wet weather often remained ankle-deep in mud and foul water, and in the wider ways. After every rainstorm, the water streamed from the house roofs upon the cobblestones and ran out to the kennels. But the value of fresh air and cleanliness in the person and the house was little understood. Confined wooden buildings with projecting upper stories that almost met over street